It's time for this week's episode of Brandon Sports Talk, featuring in-depth interviews from those who are trending in the world of athletics. And now, here's the host of Brandon Sports Talk, Brandon Pate.
Welcome back to Brandon Sports Talk. In today's episode, I have the privilege of interviewing the Keep the Flame Alive Olympic podcast with Allison and Jill. How are y'all doing today?
Hi,
Doing
thanks for
great.
having us.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can you talk about how you knew that y'all wanted to start out with a podcast talking about the Olympics?
I'll let you
Well,
do that, Jill.
sure. Well, I went, Allison and I used to work together a long time ago in Chicago, and it was during the 2002 Olympics. So we knew we both loved the games. And at that time, I worked in an office. So you had a water cooler to talk around and people to talk with. Then I became a freelance writer and lost that water cooler environment. And even though I had some friends with whom we'd have some really great opening ceremonies parties, I really missed that interaction of talking with people on a day-to-day basis. So I thought about starting a blog, and that was really hard, and it didn't have that interaction that I liked. So Allison was coming through my town one day, and I said, "Hey, how about a podcast? Do you want to try a podcast?" And she said, "Yep." And it just has gone on from there.
Of course, Jill, how did you come up with the name Keep the Flame Alive when starting out the Olympic podcast?
Well, we first started out being called Olympic Fever, and we ended every show, starting with episode one, with Keep the Flame Alive, because that was just our motto and philosophy for the show was we were going to keep the flame going throughout the 4 years that the Olympics weren't on. So the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee eventually said to us, look, you can't use that name and try to raise money for your show because they actually own the copyright to that, and the trademark to the words Olympic in the United States. So we talked with our listeners and said, hey, we've got to change the name of our show. What do you think it should be? And they all came back with Keep the Flame Alive.
Of course, Allison, how did y'all know that y'all wanted to interview primarily Olympics and Paralympians?
When we started, we originally thought we were going to do more produced stories. And early on, we had an opportunity to go to the Olympic Training Center in Lake Placid, New York, and got a chance to talk to some bobsledders. And we just had such a great time doing that and got kind of different stories from them because we were able to do long form interviews. And we said, wait a second, this is actually much more interesting to us than producing these packaged, kind of investigative, research heavy reports. So then we started looking at the interviews.
Of course, what was that experience like going to Lake Placid to the Olympic training facility and interviewing those bobsledders?
Oh, it was so much fun. It was so exciting. I remember the Lake Placid Olympics, so it was particularly exciting to me. That's really the first one that I have distinct and I know aren't reconstructed memories of. So seeing those sites, seeing the places was great. And then just meeting the bobsledders. They were so enthusiastic to talk about their sport. They were very generous with their stories, and no question was too ridiculous for them, which gave us a really great sense of these athletes just want to tell their stories if anybody asks them. It's just, you got to get them going, give them a platform, and they will tell you all kinds of things.
Of course, what was that experience like getting to cover that Lake Placid Olympics?
Well, we didn't get to cover anything. I was a kid, so it's not, it's more my childhood memories of those Olympics.
Of course, Jill, what were some of your favorite memories getting to cover the Olympics?
Well, we covered the first Olympics that we were a podcast for was Pyeongchang 2018. Those were winter games, and we were on our couch because we had just started the podcast. and didn't know how to get accredited or anything like that. And then for 2020 in Tokyo, we were too late to apply for accreditations. And then I was supposed to go as a fan, and Allison was going to be on the couch, and we were going to record that way. But then fans were no longer allowed to Tokyo 2021 because of COVID restrictions. And then for Beijing 2022, which was the last Winter Olympics, we had talked about applying for accreditation and had decided that that wasn't going to be for us, not this games. It was going to be a long trip, a hard trip, and we would just keep doing what we were doing and kind of recover, because we were also getting past the main initial hump of having to change our name, which was a very involved process, and the pandemic took out a lot from both of us. So we said no. And then the deadline was coming up to apply for accreditation, and I was talking with my husband, and we'd had a few drinks, and he said, "Oh, you should apply anyway, just let him know you're interested." So I filled out the application right there and forgot about it. And then a few months later, we get an email saying, "Oh, you've gotten accreditation for the Olympics." I said, "Whoa, Allison, I don't know how this happened." And then I remembered that fateful night where I did fill out the application and forgot to tell Allison. So, and then a few weeks later, we got another email that we got 2 accreditations for the Paralympics in Beijing. So now we were both going for some or all of it. And that was it. We couldn't turn down this opportunity. So Beijing was a very different experience than what we anticipate Paris will be, because we were in what they called a closed loop. They kept us all contained within the Olympic environment. And it was really interesting. It was really cool to be there in person and see these sports live, because there's something about seeing the events happen live that you miss when you see them on TV. You don't understand how high jumps are, or how much I just remember the mogul skiers floating in midair in a way that I couldn't see that on TV. And you get a sense of the environment and how special the event is a whole lot more.
Of course, Allison, what was that moment like getting to cover the Olympics live at Beijing?
Well, I was there for the Paralympics. I was not there for the Olympics. And it was kind of wild. I landed in Beijing. Jill had been there for several weeks already and made it over to the hotel. And we were so excited to see each other because we hadn't been together, in the same country for several weeks. And it was scary and overwhelming and fantastic all at the same time. And there were no international fans. So it was very tight. We always saw the same people on the bus and the same people in the hotels. But it became very much like, okay, we're all in this crazy situation and we're going to make it through and enjoy these sports and just have a great time with these athletes.
Of course, Jill, what does that process look like for those podcasts or even reporters out there looking to apply for the Olympics?
Well, you've got to start early, because when did we apply for Paris? It's like a 1.5 year long process to 2 years, depending on the games. So we applied last
December, I think it was.
Yeah, we applied in December. We didn't hear about it until just a couple of months ago, early this spring. And then the Paralympics we heard about maybe in June or so.
Yeah,
And
maybe a month or so ago.
right, and we're 11 months away from Paris. So it's a lot of planning. For us, because we are considered a web-based media organization, we get accredited through the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee. So you had to look to them for a form to fill out, and a lot of it is knowing, who you are, what you cover, how often you cover the games, and they want to know stats about your publication as well. So they know that it's not just something that you and your mom and your dad read and or listen to or watch. They want to know that you're actually reaching an audience. So they can be very competitive. The process for Paris we understand it was a very, very competitive process. A lot of organizations really want to be there. So we feel very fortunate to have been selected. And then it turns into a lot of planning after that. So right now we're working on securing accommodations, and then we'll be working on a fundraiser to help us get there. We have to arrange flights pretty soon, and then just keep planning what we'll do content wise, where we'll be, what and how we'll get around, and that kind of thing.
Of course, Allison, starting off with you, how is that like obviously getting to hear these Olympics and Paralympians stories and sharing them?
I love the athletes. I often complain on the show about anything that gets in the way of allowing the athletes to perform at their highest level. So any kind of doping or any kind of, interference of the governing bodies. So being able to talk to these people, especially the athletes in smaller sports that don't get as much attention. I love hearing all the nitty-gritty. I mean, one of our favorite questions for people who use equipment like pole vaulters or hockey players is, how do you travel with your equipment? And they always have fantastic travel stories. And my favorite thing an athlete says is, "Oh, nobody's ever asked me that question before." We get so excited when an athlete responds that way, like, "Oh, I've always wanted to tell this story, but no one ever asked." And that's when I know we hit the absolute sweet spot of an interview.
Of course, Jill, what are some of your favorite memories and moments covering these Olympics and Olympic Olympians and Paralympians?
Oh gosh, it is so hard to pick just a few because every interview we do becomes our next favorite interview, and it's like choosing. It's almost a Sophie's choice, which you don't know which of your children to choose best, although not quite as dramatic as Sophie had it. But oh, I love talking about equipment. As Allison said, we've had some great talks with sailors and with kayakers about transporting boats all over the world. We've heard how hard it is for shooters to take guns and ammunition around the world. Oh gosh, who else have we talked? We've talked about surfaces lately. We got to talk with someone from the manufacturing company that makes the field hockey pitch, and that is just fascinating to me, how all of this works and how so many people are working for the athletes to make sure that they have the best conditions possible.
Who are some of the interviews that y'all have previously had?
Well, the ones that come to mind this week are athletics, since it's World Athletics Championship Week. So Katie Moon, formerly Najat, Deanna Price, race walker Evan Dunphy, who didn't medal, who finished fourth. I mean, those are the ones that come to mind right this second because they're competing this week in Budapest.
Right. And we also, World Para Powerlifting Championships are coming up. So we interviewed para powerlifter Louise Sugden, and she has coming off of an injury to compete in her first tournament in over a year. And she's just beyond thrilled to be there. So we are excited to watch her compete as well.
Of course, what was that experience like getting to hear these athlete stories like Katie Moon, who went to the Olympics?
Yeah, Katie was a lot of fun. And what's been fun actually is now that I'm watching her compete, I see the things that she talked about. She talked about that she has trouble with her speed and with taking off with power. And when you hear them talk about the very nitty gritty of their sport, especially something like pole vault, where you think you know what they're doing, and then you hear, oh, yes, I'm putting my hands this particular way for this particular reason, it becomes very exciting to watch them actually compete and say, oh, yes, she was talking about that problem with her thumb or that hand position, or she switched lengths of poles. So it just becomes so much more fun when you can, especially when you can sound really smart on the couch next to your family. Oh, I know why she just switched poles. So that always is a great experience to really, really enjoy the sports.
Of
Yeah,
course,
and well, one of the things we talked about with Katie, and this I think is where Allison and I have one of our sweet spots and being a podcast, is that we talk a lot about how things work. And at a big tournament previously, a pole vaulter snapped her pole while she was jumping, and dropped out of the rest of the tournament and took a lot of flack on social media for doing so. And what Katie talked to us about was what happens to your body when a pull breaks and the amount of energy that shocks through you and how hard it is to recover from that. And that's stuff we didn't know before. And it makes you look a lot smarter.
Of course, what is that moment like getting to see those athletes that you've interviewed, getting to see them perform on TV and saying, oh, hey, I interviewed them when they talked about this and that?
So the very first time we were covering an Olympics on the podcast was Pyeongchang, as Jill said earlier. And during the opening ceremonies, one of the people that we had interviewed was bobsledder Lauren Gibbs. And I was sitting on the couch and I waved at the television as if she could see me. I was so excited to see her on the television. Oh, there's Lauren. I know her. And you forget for that moment that, wait a second, she can't see you. But I get very attached to the athletes that we cover, because we do spend almost an hour with most of them, sometimes even more. And they do get very relaxed with us. We are, as I'm sure you can tell, not very serious. We're not trying to, find their deepest, darkest secrets. We want to know about their sports. We want to hear them talk about why they're excited about their sports. So, and then we follow them on social media. So I do get very attached and I do take it very personally when when I'm watching the sports. In Tokyo, one of our interviewees, Connor, and his name is escaping me, Jill.
Connor Fields.
Connor Fields, a BMX racer, was hurt very, very badly. And that felt personal. That felt like, oh, my friend got hurt so badly. I hope he's okay. And I'm sending messages on Instagram to his family, like, I know you don't know me, but we interviewed your son and he was amazing and I hope he's okay. So we do get very attached.
Of course, how do y'all find the athletes that y'all have had the privilege of interviewing?
Well, some of them come to us and through publicists may find us. Sometimes we get invited to media events, and that is helpful to talk to people. And then a lot of it is figuring out what sports we want to cover and then who we'd want to talk to. We try really hard to have representation from outside of the US. So, and a lot of that is figuring out, okay, who would be a good person to talk to, or we'll find a message or a mention in a news story about an athlete. And I remember this, we talked with a swimmer from the Seychelles who actually went to college in the US. And I know that I only found out about her because something came up in a news search or a news feed that I get. And it was from the Seychelles Olympic Committee talking about their athletes. I was like, oh, this would be interesting to talk to an athlete from a tiny little island in the Indian Ocean. And she came on the show and was delightful.
Of course, what does that research process look like when you finally do get that Olympian or Paralympian? After receiving them, what does that research process look like before getting the interview with them?
We start with the basics. As if they're from Team USA or whichever team they're from, there's always an information sheet available on the website to get the basics. And then we often start watching other videos of their competition, videos of other interviews, articles that if they've been interviewed before. If it's a particular sport, for instance, when we talked to Chuck Aoki of wheelchair rugby, we had a lot of questions from watching wheelchair rugby during Tokyo. So that fed a lot of our questions for him. So it depends on what the focus of the interview is going to be, but it's old school, like doing a research paper. You just got to read and search and collect as much data as possible ahead of time.
Of course, Jill, starting off with you, who would be your dream interview to land?
It's hard because right now my dream interview is talking with somebody, I believe from Mondo, whoever makes the track for track and field. I want to talk with them. And I'd also love to talk with either a shoe historian or somebody from Nike or Adidas to talk about the evolution of running shoes, because that's something our listeners have been very curious about, and we just haven't cracked the code yet of who to talk to.
Allison?
So I'm going to put realistic dream and absolutely pie in the sky dream. So my realistic dream right now is Rowdy Gaines. I'd like to talk to him about both his swimming career and his broadcasting career. He's probably one of my favorites right now. I love that he loves the athletes and kind of how that evolved. And then my absolute pie in the sky one would be Princess Anne from Great Britain, who was an Olympian herself in 1976 and has been absolutely integral to the British Olympic Committee and London 2012. I know how to curtsy, so I can pull that, but I know she does not talk to even big press like the BBC. So that would be, if I had a genie, maybe I'd get 5 minutes with her.
Of course, with track and field being so popular right now, what track and field athlete as an Olympian or Paralympian would y'all like to interview?
I'm going
I'd
to say, oh, go ahead, Jill.
I was going to say I'd like to interview discus thrower Valerie Allman. I'd love to hear from shot putter Ryan Krauser, because I know he's changed up his stance and his throwing technique, and I really want to know the how he decided to do that and the process of analyzing what he was doing and what he needed to do and making that switch. 'Cause he's amazing. Oh gosh, I don't know. Somebody in triple jump. I'm so curious about that. High jumpers, very curious about that. So lots of stuff to talk about.
Yeah, I would
Allison?
say probably Shelly Ann Fraser Price. I'm a big fan of hers, so I'd like to talk with her. She like me is about 5 feet tall, which is very unusual for a track athlete. So I'd like to have some short people conversation. Hunter Woodhall, who's a para athlete who is married to, I hope I'm getting this correctly, Tara Davis Woodhall, who is competing right now in Budapest. So they would be fun to have on together, both as when you sort of train with your spouse, but you're in different sports, and how that works about not taking the job home, but you kind of take the job home, how that balance can work for them.
Of course, as a podcaster and interviewing Olympians and Paralympians, what is that moment I made it moment for y'all?
Getting the Paris accreditation was a very big deal. Um, but I don't know if I've ever felt that. That's probably the closest. And I hope I never feel that in a way, because one of the things we love to do on the show is we're fans first, and then journalists and podcasters second. So I never want to lose that absolute 7-year-old meeting your hero kind of feeling when we're doing the show.
Jill?
Same. I mean, it was really super exciting. It was so exciting to get accredited for Beijing, because that felt like we were legitimized, and it was also such a relief, and also another form of legitimization to get the Paris accreditation, because we knew it would be really tough for summer, and it means a lot to us that we're seen as a good source in the Olympic and Paralympic broadcasting community or podcasting community.
Of course, what are some of y'all's future plans in your podcast journey?
Can we see past Paris right now? I mean, we sort of have our plans mapped out in the sense of, Milan Cortina is 2026, LA is 2028. We don't know where 2030 is going to be, and then 2032 is in Brisbane. So on the one hand, we have this very strict map that we see of years and timelines and places. But on the other hand, we don't know what that's going to look like, because we don't know how sports are going to change, how athletes are going to change, how coverage is going to change. So we always love to do the stories that aren't being told. So what is that going to look like in 5 years? I don't know.
Of course, after Paris, Do y'all have plans to cover LA in 2028?
Of course, of course. It's going to be a huge moment. Los Angeles 1984 was the Olympics that hooked me as a little kid. So I am so excited to see them come back and host again. They did a great time the first time around. It was at a moment in Olympic history where the International Olympic Committee really needed to have a good games to help the movement survive. And LA delivered, and they're going to deliver again. It's just going to be a phenomenal show. The games have gotten, or athletes have gotten even more amazing since then. And LA 1984 had some amazing moments in sports history. But it's just going to be incredible from the athlete perspective and also the fan perspective and from the organizing perspective, I think.
Of course, what are some of the things that y'all have learned now that y'all didn't know before getting started with the podcast and interviewing Olympians and Paralympians?
Oh, so much. So much. We were not journalists prior to doing the podcast, so we didn't have that training and that background. So the amount of research that we realized we needed to do to really be prepared for an interview was a big thing that I learned. You can't go into it cold. You can't just wing it. You have to be prepared. But by the same token, if a conversation takes an interesting veer to the left, you go. And you really need to listen to what your subject is talking about. And if it sparks a question, I always keep pencil and paper next to me. And sometimes they'll be saying something and I'm frantically writing it down. And, Jill and I have just gotten better because we've been doing this now for several years. At the beginning, if you go back and watch or listen to the early shows, please be understanding, we were really learning. We've gotten better. So our ability to work together as an interview team, just it grows over time. Like any team, you get used to each other's little eye motions and quirks. And, oh, when I click my tongue, that means I can't think of a question, or all those little things that you couldn't even explain to someone else.
Jill, what are some of the things that you've learned now that you didn't know beforehand?
Oh, just the incredible amount of work that goes into producing a podcast. And I would imagine that for you, the same thing that goes into producing a video cast, that it's a lot of work behind the scenes. And I mean, we knew nothing about producing audio before. And now I know something about microphones. I know something about how to get a podcast out that sounds pretty decent. Hoping, knocking on wood here, but that's been, the technical side has been very interesting to learn, and I really appreciate having that knowledge, especially as podcasts become more and more prevalent, having been a veteran doing them for almost 6 years.
Of course, what advice would you give for those people out there that are looking to cover the Olympics and Paralympics as a podcast?
No, we're doing that. We actually have spoken to other Olympic podcasts in other countries, and you will always bring your own perspective. They bring their perspective from their countries and their backgrounds. We as women, we seem to be the only women who are doing this particular field, and that brings a different perspective. So every person covering an event or a topic brings to it their biases and their enthusiasms, whichever those may be. So, even if it's not a podcast about the Olympics, I say your voice is valid and you deserve to be heard.
And I would add to that, it'd be interesting to hear a perspective from people of color. We don't have that in podcasting, the Olympics and the other games and sporting events, maybe in other sports, but not so much in the Olympics. It would be great to have that perspective. But I would say one of the things that we do really well is we don't necessarily go after the big name athletes that you would think of when you think of the Olympics. And we know that at a Summer Olympics, there are 10,500 athletes. So there are 10,500 stories And we like looking for the people who have an interesting story or something unusual, or ones who may not get to talk to the media as much because they're equally deserving of the attention and sharing their story with the world.
What advice would you give those people out there that are looking to interview those Olympians and Paralympians and hear their stories?
Do your research. Really
Right.
know what you're getting into, and because especially the bigger names or the more experienced athletes, they've done a lot. They don't want to get asked the same 5 questions.
Right. And also be willing to wait because athletes have very tight schedules sometimes. Sometimes they're competing for a week at a time or 2 weeks at a time. Sometimes they're in training mode and they don't always have the time for an interview. You may have to wait 6 weeks. You may have to wait a year, but keep trying and just be willing to be flexible. If they have to cancel, be willing to reschedule because once you get that story finally, it's usually worth the wait.
That's great advice. Where can my listeners find you at on social media and podcast platforms?
Oh,
We-
should I be doing this? Because I always do this on I always do the little
Right.
bit on the end of our shows. So on Twitter and X, I'll get this right.
Mhm.
On X and Instagram, we are at Flame Alive Pod. Our website is flamealivepod.com. And then we're pretty much on all the podcast apps, Apple and Google, and it's
Mhm.
Keep the Flame Alive.
And we also have a great Facebook group. It's Keep the Flame Alive podcast. So if you are one of our people, look for us there and join the fun. We have a great conversation like all the time. It's not even just during the Olympics. There are great conversations going on right now that you don't want to miss.
Thank you again, Allison and Jill, for your interview, and best luck in your future with Keep the Flame Alive, the Olympic podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brandon.
Thank you. You can find Brandon Sports Talk on Instagram at Brandon Sports Talk, Twitter at Talk_Brandon, and you can find me on YouTube at Brandon Sports Talk. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you again, Jill and Allison, for your interview, and best luck in your future.
You've been watching Brandon Sports Talk. Please feel free to like, share, and subscribe to Brandon Sports Talk on social media and on YouTube.